Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I've been just having a chat with Mohammed now, and he's been telling me about the huge variety of initiatives that he's involved with to do with raising awareness about history amongst the community, and I think that's a great thing, and I'm very pleased to have been invited here today. I'm going to speak to you today about a figure who I've spent roughly the last 4 or so years of my life researching and writing about. He was the focus of my PhD thesis, which I did in London, and his name is Keshab Chandra Sen. And may I just ask how many of you have heard of him? Quite a few, okay. Well, I've described him in the title of my lecture as Bengal's forgotten prophet, and it seems that he hasn't been forgotten by everyone, which is good. But I do think that he has been relatively neglected in terms of history writing concerning Bengal. I realised as I began to write this lecture that I can't cover his whole life in a single lecture because we'll be here all night. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time to have a discussion afterwards. And what I'm going to do is to focus on just one moment in Keshav's life, which is his visit to Britain in 1870. Specifically, I want to give a sense of some of the arguments Keshav made to British audiences during his visit. Before I discuss this, I'll give a short introduction to the culture and society out of which Keshav emerged, and at the end of the lecture I'll give a very brief account of his later life, which many interesting things happened in his later life, but I can't cover that all today. Can you all hear me okay? Keshab Chandra Sen was born in Calcutta in November 1838, a time in Bengali history which is now very much associated with the idea of the Bengal Renaissance. The Bengal Renaissance has been identified by some historians as a time of intense cultural production and social reformation centred in Calcutta in roughly the first quarter of the 19th century, but extending well beyond that. The period of the Bengal Renaissance witnessed a significant increase in the number and influence of institutions providing English education in Calcutta, and also a significant increase in the number and influence of evangelical Christian missionaries. This provoked a response in Bengal and beyond, which led to the creation of some distinctively new ideas and organisations. Some of these organisations, such as the movement known as Young Bengal, embraced the growing influence of British culture. So-called Western science and even Christianity, and they came to see the future of India as lying in its adoption of the values of the West. Other organisations, however, were established to oppose the westernisation of Indian society and sought to define and to defend the cultural and religious heritage of, in particular, Hinduism. The Religious and Social Reform Association, known as the Brahmo Samaj, founded in 1828 by a very famous reformer who I'm sure you all know, Rammohun Roy, and which Keshab Chandra Sen joined in 1857 and came to lead a faction of from 1866. The Brahmo Samaj tried to find a middle ground, arguing that English education was to be encouraged, but alongside the promotion of India's cultural heritage. Brahmos argued that Hinduism needed to be reformed along rational and scientific lines, and that practices such as polygamy, idolatry, early marriage and sati, widow burning, should be eradicated, but that this project should never result in the westernisation of India, much less the Christianisation of India. The Brahmo vision of India's future was one in which India would embrace aspects of Western culture without losing its own cultural heritage. The first quarter of the 19th century was, therefore, a period in Bengali history when questions of what it meant to be Indian, to be British, to be Hindu or Christian, Eastern or Western were highly significant and hotly contested. And historians have certainly recognised this, and this period in Bengali history has become a focal point for scholarship concerned with the impact of imperialism, capitalism and Western culture on Indian society, and also more recently for studies concerned with the ways in which both Britain and India were transformed as they interacted. At one extreme, some historians have found in the Bengal Renaissance the beginnings of Indian modernity, characterised by progressivism, rationalism and social reform, which ultimately resulted in Indian self-rule informed by quote-unquote enlightened Western values. At the other extreme, historians have viewed the Bengal Renaissance as a period in which Western power increased to the extent that it began to colonise minds, robbing Indians of agency and drawing the Bengali elite into a self-serving and ultimately futile collaboration with their British rulers. As you can imagine, historians have taken all manner of positions between these two rather caricatured extremes. Keshab Chandra Sen was in many ways a child of the Bengal Renaissance, who embodied many of the diverse and sometimes divergent strands of thought which characterised its intellectual, social and political landscape. He was an elite figure. He was born into a powerful and wealthy family of bankers with strong connections to the British administration. He was educated in his early years by an elderly Bengali guru, but later went on to receive an English education at Hindu College. He believed firmly that the British had been sent by God to rule India. But he was also deeply critical of many aspects of British imperialism. He was suspicious of what he called Western materialism, and he was convinced that India had played and should continue to play a vital role in the development of world history. Keshav was also influenced deeply by the universalist attitudes of Rammohun Roy, perhaps the most well-known figure associated with the Bengal Renaissance. Rammohun's activities and principles, his commitment to universal theism, the idea of a single universal God, his commitment to social reform, to education, the rights of women, his use of the press, his use of reason as the ultimate standard by which to judge religion, his conviction that religious faith was purest in its most ancient forms, his inclusive attitude towards other faiths, and his conviction that progress in India should involve both the technologies of Western civilization and the ancient traditions of Hindu and Muslim civilizations. All these principles associated with Rammohun Roy very much influenced Keshav's worldview, although he was to move away from some of these principles in the later years of his life. When Keshab Chandra Sen joined the Brahmo Samaj in 1857, it was operating under the leadership of Debendranath Tagore, the father of the well-known poet, more than well-known, Rabindranath. The organisation initially had functioned effectively as a small church and debating society, but under Debendranath Tagore's leadership, its influence and popularity expanded a great deal, and Brahmoism acquired a distinctive theology and distinctive ideas about the ways in which Hinduism should be reformed. Having joined the organisation, Keshav rose rapidly through the ranks of the Brahmo Samaj, and he became a minister in 1862. And as his influence within the organisation grew, he became increasingly dissatisfied with Debendranath Tagore's approach to social reform, and particularly with Debendranath's attempts to move Brahmoism closer to what was then called Orthodox Hinduism. Keshav argued that the older generation of Brahmos, while paying lip service to a liberal, rational religion, were guilty of practicing idolatrous Hindu rites in their own homes. And a schism took place, and Keshav came to lead his own faction of the movement, which was called the Brahmo Samaj of India. Keshav became established as a powerful, prominent figure in the religious and social life of Bengal. In 1869, Keshav announced his intention to visit England. He wanted to visit for three primary reasons. First, to study English culture and society, and to gather information on the ways in which English charitable institutions ran. Second, to inform the English public of defects within the British administration in India. And third, to promote the faith of the Brahmo Samaj of India. He also wanted to establish a Brahmo church in England. He didn't achieve that. And his visit was organised by the British and Foreign Unitarian Society, who had been in contact with Brahmos in Calcutta since the 1820s and had participated in the organisation of the visit to England of Ramanujan Roy. He visited in the 1830s. British Unitarianism, which is a religious movement which grew out of Protestant descent and lay on the fringes of Christianity, shared a lot in common with Brahmoism in terms of religious and social principles. Although Unitarianism encompassed quite a wide spectrum of beliefs, the movement was distinguished by its focus on universal theism, that is, Unitarians believed in the existence of a single God. They denied the divinity of Jesus. And Unitarianism was also distinguished by a desire to rationalise religion, to bring it into conformity with the latest scientific discoveries. A liberal and accepting attitude towards people of all faiths, and a focus on the importance of education, especially amongst women. The similarity between the ideas of Keshav's form of Brahmoism and British Unitarianism led to strong connections between the two movements developing in the course of the 19th century. Lots of correspondence exists between them, exchanging journals, books, this kind of thing. And by the time of Keshav's visit to Britain in 1870, the Unitarians had come to wield considerable economic and political power, even though their numbers were small, and they occupied a marginalised place in English religious life. Their numerous contacts, political, social, journalistic, along with some of Keshav's own political connections, transformed Keshav into something of a celebrity during his time in Britain. It was very unusual for somebody like Keshav to visit Britain and have access to large audiences at this time. He could draw very big crowds. People were intrigued to find out about him. And he delivered speeches at over 60 public engagements. His activities were reported in over 50 contemporary newspapers and journals, which is what I spent a lot of my time reading when I was doing my PhD. He met with many of the leading intellectuals and reformers of the day. He was presented to the Queen, and he exchanged words with Prime Minister Gladstone. In my estimation, during the 6 months he stayed in Britain, he delivered sermons and lectures to a combined audience of over 40,000 people. So he had a big audience. I want to focus now on some of the main arguments that Keshav made to these British audiences. Firstly, what did he have to say about historical and political connections between Britain and India? Secondly, what were his views of British society? He was publicly critical of many aspects of British rule in India, but he framed his criticisms within a broader view of the history of British imperialism, which was largely positive. In Keshav's view, this was a very common view at the time, the greatness of India lay in a past golden age of pure, uncorrupted and monotheistic Hinduism. The demise of this age had been engendered by the Muslim era, in Keshav's view, and secondly, by the dominance of particular Hindu priests who had encouraged superstition, child marriage and polygamy, fortified caste divisions, and effectively corrupted ancient Hinduism. And in Keshav's view, it was the British nation that had then been sent by God to rescue India from this decline. It's a very commonly held version of history at the time. So Keshav subscribed clearly to a view of history which placed contemporary British society at the apex of civilization. But this view existed alongside another conception of historical progress which gave to India a special place within the scale of nations, as it was called. The narrative of progress of liberal imperialism broadly was that civilizations were placed at different points in time, and it was the burden of the more advanced nations to speed up the progress to modernity of the less advanced nations. But in Keshav's hands, this narrative was transformed into one in which India played a vital role. He almost always explained what he felt was unique about the Indian nation, which was a term he used frequently, the Indian nation and the Indian mind, through contrast with his perceptions of the English. He delivered one address entitled "My Impressions of England," and the theme he took up first was English commerce and activity. So this is Keshav on the English in general. The first thing that struck me and dazzled my eyes in London was the brilliancy and splendour of your shops. Everywhere was handbills and advertisements. The Englishman's activity troubled me very much. He works and cannot live for anything like contemplation or thought. He is a machine made for work, eternal and everlasting work. The qualities Keshav ascribed to India in another lecture that he gave were in stark contrast to this. This is how he sums up India and Indians in general. When I turn to my country in the East, I find warmth of heart, solitary contemplation, deep communion with the indwelling spirit of the one supreme God. I see a voluntary and deliberate withdrawing of the heart from all anxieties and cares of the world. In Keshav's view, what English civilization lacked, Indian civilization could provide. In Keshav's view, India and England embody entirely different qualities, but complementary qualities. Neither nation, as he referred to both Britain and India, could progress towards truth or God without the other. Now, the association of India with the spiritual and the emotional, and of England with the material and the rational, had been a trope of British Orientalism, utilitarianism for generations, and ideas of Indian spirituality, that India is a particularly spiritual place. They date back in European thought way back to at least the 16th century. And while Keshav's division of the world into a spiritualized East and a materialist West drew in part on these traditions of thinking, the way in which he conceptualized the interaction of East and West was quite distinctive and new. As many scholars have observed, liberal imperialist progress narratives of the 19th century were based on an assumption that Western knowledge, Western scientific rational knowledge, occupied a privileged position in relation to the knowledge that people from outside the West had of themselves, which often seemed irrational, unscientific, and subjective. The idea here was that the huge diversity of experience in a place like India could only be understood by an observer who was outside that experience and had the superior, supposedly superior Western knowledge, which enabled them to explain what Indians couldn't explain for themselves. This view began to predominate in British intellectual and political circles in the 1820s and 1830s, and it found perhaps its most systematic expression in James Mill's very influential History of British India, which he completed in 1818. In contrast to this view of history, which puts a huge amount of weight on Western knowledge and experience as a standard through which you can understand the world, Keshav emphasised the subjective nature of knowledge and experience. Hopefully this will become clear what I mean here. And this is particularly evident in the way that he characterised Christianity. So this is a quote from Keshav, very boldly speaking to a British audience about Christianity. Christ has come to India in a foreign and repulsive form. There is no reason why Christianity should in the present day be presented to the Indian population in any other than an Oriental and Asiatic aspect. Do we not find in the Bible images and precepts of an Asiatic and Oriental stamp? Do we not feel that the spirit of Christianity comes to us as something very natural, something with which, by the very peculiar constitution of the Indian mind, we are bound to sympathise? The spirit of Christianity, according to Keshav, transcended national boundaries, and the truth of religion couldn't be comprehended fully by any single nation. Every nation contributed to an understanding of the truth of religion, or any kind of truth for that matter, by perceiving it from a unique angle. Keshav sums this up in this way: Christianity is a many-sided religion, and every individual and nation takes in a small portion of this many-sided thing. So according to this view, in order to comprehend truth and religion, in order to understand the world, different nations, different minds need to exchange their unique perspectives. While Keshav was convinced that British rule in India was sanctioned by God and that Indian progress depended to a great extent on the spread of Western customs and values, he argued also that progress required different civilizations to interact and to learn from each other. In Keshav's view, just as the East could not progress without the influence of the West, so the West could not progress without the influence of the East. So he saw progress in the future as not being the transformation of India along Western lines. He saw it more in terms of Britain and India interacting and both being transformed in the process. And at the time, that was a fairly unique view. So, in Keshav's view, the westernization of Indians through the spread of Christianity, through education, could, if it wasn't properly managed, result in nothing less than the loss of a perspective on truth which was peculiarly Eastern and which was of equal value to perspectives offered by the West. As Keshav put it to the congregation of the Union Chapel in Islington in a phrase that was widely reproduced and became very controversial in Britain, as Keshav put it, truth is not European. Keshav's view of history and of progress bolstered his conviction that Indians not only had much to learn, but much to teach. Part of the purpose of his mission to England was to teach the English about what they were doing wrong in the administration of India. Keshav urged the government to employ more natives in the administrative machinery, declaring that, quote, the natives, if properly trained, are not unfit to hold the highest offices in the state. However, while he undoubtedly believed in the equal capacity of Indians and Britons to hold high office, Keshav at no point in England made demands for Indians to participate in representative government. Keshav's conviction that progress depended on different nations preserving their unique qualities and exchanging their unique perspectives lay behind wider concerns he expressed in relation to what he called ideas and projects of denationalising the Indian nation. He spoke of a patriotic fire running through my heart before making the following appeal. This is a quote from Keshav. Proud of our nationality, we shall ask you to give us all the good things that you have in England, but not your corruptions. Let the stream of enlightenment and knowledge which you send forth to my country promote morality and religion without sweeping away Indian nationality. You are as much responsible as we are for the jealous and careful preservation of everything that is good and ennobling in Indian society. The elements of Indian society which Keshav wished to see preserved were to be found in, quote, quiet little villages in the provinces where one could see, as Keshav described it, homely Hindu life in its original and primitive simplicity. Keshav contrasted the purity of primitive Hindu life, he used the word primitive a lot, of primitive Hindu life with a vision of a materialistic and mechanical Western civilization. While Keshav often referred to the power of English education to engender civilization, and he often spoke of the virtues of civilized English men, civilized English women, he also used the term civilization in a different way. He used it to denote an excessive concern with material objects and with physical pleasures. In an address of May 1870, he spoke with evident passion about what he called the ravages of so-called civilization, which were obliterating a simpler, purer form of life. The picture he paints is of an India under threat, of an older, purer society being killed off by the creeping vices of modernity. This is a quote from Keshav now. Go into the quiet little villages in the provinces and you see their homely Hindu life in its purity and charming simplicity. But where is that simplicity and purity now? It is fast dying out among the ravages of so-called civilization. All these modern vices are fast creeping into Indian society and depriving it of its original and primitive simplicity. Chief among the modern vices of so-called civilization, in Keshav's view, was alcohol. Keshav chastised the British administration for placing before young Indian men a dangerous cocktail of new ideas and alcoholic liquors. And he frequently, a favourite story that he narrated was of, quote, an ignorant Indian who, through English education, became a fine-looking, educated man, only to drink himself to death with English books on one side and the dangerous bottle of brandy on the other side. That was an image that Keshav used a lot, and it expresses his ambivalent attitude. Holding a copy of Shakespeare in one hand and a bottle of brandy in the other. That was a favourite image of his. Education without spiritual guidance would result in denationalisation, excess, and an undue regard for the external refinements and bodily pleasures of a materialistic civilization. Keshav, as I've said, was strongly in favour of the spread of English education in India. He certainly shared the British liberal faith in the power of education to promote progress. And he hoped that the 1870 Education Acts in Britain would be extended in some measure to India. He viewed English education as a cure-all which would lead to the reform of what he called backward customs and to the dissolution of caste. He believed that caste distinctions would come to an end if you spread English education. However, while Keshav stressed the ability of English education to remove corruptions from Indian society, what he called corruptions, he looked to the Hindu tradition to provide the positive content that would act as the foundation for subsequent development. This content was to be found, this is a quote, in the early books and institutions of the Hindus, where there is a substratum for future reforms as strong and firm as a rock. Now, the need to return to ancient Hindu texts as the basis for reform was, of course, central to Rammohun Roy's vision, and it was also central to Debendranath Tagore's vision, and it also formed the basis for Keshav's reformist program in India. However, Keshav's desire to use ancient Hindu texts as a basis for reform existed in tandem with his belief in the power of the Bible to regenerate India. Christianity, he informed his British audiences, quote, went to work in the very heart of the nation. While Hindu texts were of great value, the Bible was indispensable, and as he told one audience in Britain, however proud we may be of our own religious books, it is a fact which must be admitted by all candid men that India cannot do without the spirit of the Bible. And as you can imagine, when he said that, there was huge cheers from the British audience, and this quote was reproduced extensively in the press. Keshav represented Christianity as a religion which, like Hinduism, had originated in the East, and thus already constituted a part of Indian national culture. He didn't see Christianity as a Western importation. He stressed the need for Christianity in India to assume what he called an Oriental and Asiatic aspect. Keshav just conflated Oriental, Asiatic, Indian, East. They all meant the same thing to him, as with Britain, England, West. He just uses these terms completely interchangeably. And also, anticipating arguments that would later be made by Swami Vivekananda, he emphasized the Oriental character of Christ. In Keshav's view, Christianity in England was in general too muscular and hard, this is Keshav speaking, more materialistic and outward than spiritual and inward. He complained of its cold intellectualism and dreary systems. He found it extremely boring, I think, in many respects. The endless debates about theology. He later told an audience in Bombay that he had seen in England, quote, a mutilated Christianity and a mutilated Christ. I saw Christ's hand in England, but I did not see his heart and soul. Keshav's experience of Christianity in Britain convinced him that England was not more advanced in religious terms than India. And of course, the idea that it was more advanced was the idea that was being propounded by the evangelical missionaries, and he was dead against this. And as he summed it up, England is still as far from the kingdom of heaven as you and I. Keshav therefore spoke candidly to his British audiences about the shortcomings of British Christianity, and also about his impressions of the positive and negative aspects of life in England more generally. There were certain aspects of English life for which he was unprepared and which shocked him profoundly. Chief among these was the degree of poverty. He lamented the presence of poverty in a number of his public lectures in England, and he frequently characterised English society as more benighted by caste than society in India. This is a quote. I was pained to notice an institution which I certainly did not expect to find in this country. I mean caste. I thought caste was peculiar to India. Certainly in a religious sense it is, but as a social institution it perpetuates prodigious havoc in this country. Now this argument that there was caste in Britain, again, was a very different argument to the one that British audiences were used to hearing. They were used to hearing that one of the justifications for imperial rule, and one of the things which had prevented India from developing, was caste. So for Keshav to turn that round was quite an unusual thing for British audiences to hear at this time. In addition to deploring the condition of the English poor, Keshav was also critical of the manners of the English elite. On one occasion, he provided my impressions of England and delighted his audience with his perspective on English table manners. And this I shall read you a quote of Keshav on English table manners, because it shows what a good speaker he was and what a humorous speaker he was as well, which I think did count for a lot. This is Keshav. An English dinner party is a hunting party. They always go armed with spoons and forks and knives in order to attack the fowls of the air, the beasts of the wilderness and the fishes of the sea. It troubled me very much, may I say, it frightened me when I saw birds and beasts on the table, almost ready to start into existence again. My flesh creeps on my bones when I see a huge piece of roast English beef on the table. Now clearly, Keshav was enjoying himself, but his criticisms of English table manners do have quite a serious significance, because a major concern of the imperial so-called civilizing mission had been to persuade people to eat with spoons and forks and knives. Christian missionaries in particular in various parts of the empire treated instruction in the use of cutlery as an essential part of raising the condition of the quote-unquote natives. Keshav's criticism of roast English beef may have been motivated by his vegetarianism, but he could have hardly chosen a more potent gastronomic symbol of English liberty, the connection between roast beef and John Bull. So what I'm talking about here is the connection between British notions of gentlemanliness and civility and manners, and how these are marks of civilization, and how Keshav is effectively satirizing that idea. Keshav returned to India in late 1870. He was full of confidence that the British had listened to his ideas seriously, and that the British government would initiate a substantial programme of social reform in India, which would spread in English education, Christianity to some extent, and Brahmoism, and would inaugurate a new era of social and cultural exchange between Britain and India. He spent the early 1870s implementing a wide range of initiatives designed to promote education, rational religion, to alleviate poverty, to promote social equality. In the mid to late 1870s, however, Keshav moved away from many of the principles of liberal reform which characterised his worldview at the time of his visit to Britain. His focus shifted away from social reform towards more esoteric and theological concerns. And then there was a great crisis in Keshav's life, which I can't really go into in great detail, but in 1878, under pressure from the British government, he married his daughter to the Maharaja of the northeastern state of Cooch Behar. The British were trying to gain influence there, and his daughter was under the legal marriageable age at the time, and this was according to a marriage act which Keshav himself had fought hard to make law. And the marriage was regarded by many Brahmos as a hypocritical retreat into the worst excesses of orthodox Hinduism. Keshav's popularity and influence declined sharply. By 1881, he had broken with the Brahmo name completely, and he's established himself as the leader and prophet of a new religion known as the New Dispensation. And the language of cultural interaction and exchange, which he employed during his visit to Britain, came to be replaced increasingly by attacks on the British administration in India and on Western society and culture in general. By the time of his death in 1884, most Unitarians in Britain had disavowed their connection with him, and Keshav spent his last days in relative obscurity. I'm going to stop very soon. I just want to give a few general thoughts on the vision of the British-Indian relationship which Keshav provided for British audiences during his 1870 visit. When we consider his faith in the civilising capacity of education, his conviction that the British had been sent by God to rule India, his belief in the equality of different races, even if they exhibited unique qualities, and his conviction that historical progress was occurring and that the British Empire was exercising a role in furthering progress, it is tempting to conclude that he subscribed broadly to a liberal imperialist worldview, and many historians have characterised him in this way. And we might even say that his desire to see sustained intervention in India in terms of religious and social, cultural practices, that desire for a lot of intervention had much more in common with British government policy in the early 19th century rather than post 1857 and 1858. However, the narrative of progress that Keshav presented to British audiences was driven not only by the spread of English liberty and education, but also by an interaction between East and West, which would lead to the regeneration of both Britain and India. And this interaction was conceptualised within a view of knowledge which challenged assumptions that the West held a monopoly on truth, on knowledge. Keshav's attitude towards Western civilization was ambivalent. On the one hand, civilization stood for education, the spread of freedom, freedom from superstition, prejudice and error. On the other hand, civilization stood for servitude to material goods. While the knowledge of the West could free India from what Keshav saw as the errors of its past, it was the knowledge of the Indian mind and nation which would provide the basis for freedom in the future. And Keshav imagined India as a nation through identifying a set of qualities that were unique to the Indian mind by trying to show how different Indians were. So his view of what a nation was based on the idea that it was something innate to Indians. So it didn't depend on representative government, it didn't depend on independence. In Keshav's view, the continuance and strengthening of the British-Indian connection would not result in the transformations of Indians into Englishmen. Rather, it would transform both Indians and Britons through a process of equal exchange. Now, I've only been able to give you a very brief glimpse into Keshav's later life. I haven't been able to say anything about how the British responded to him. But I should just say that by the 1880s, Keshav had been forced to accept that the liberal reform schemes he proposed during his visit to Britain for mass education, for greater participation for Indians in government, that this was not going to be happening. This wasn't going to happen. The British were not going to adopt it. By the 1880s, this liberal vision of Indian reform and, in some cases, eventual self-government under the benevolent tutelage of benevolent imperialism, this had been revealed to be a charade, and a religious solution to political and social problems had been revealed to be inadequate. But Keshav's vision of the British-Indian connection, as he expressed it in 1870, does, I think, give us some insight into the complex and ambivalent ways in which many elite figures conceptualised British rule in India in this period. It was rare for children of the Bengal Renaissance either to reject completely or to embrace entirely the influence of British society and Western culture. It was not until the later 19th century and early 20th century that subsequent generations of Indian nationalists would come to realise that the ideals of universalism of the sort that Keshav propounded in 1870 would ultimately prove impossible to realise in the context of imperialism. I'm going to stop there. Did that make sense?
It did. Just apologize for the noise. Now you can interact with John asking questions and so on.
Were you able to hear most of it? There was a fair bit of background noise, wasn't there? Was it all right? You were able to hear? Okay, all right.
Any question?
I don't want to play into the prejudices that you were talking about, Calcutta and Bangladesh, but I just did wonder where Muslims fitted into this kind of universalism.
Yeah. Shall I use this again? I guess I'll get the noise. That's a very good question. So do you want me to repeat the question? So the question was, given these universalist ideas, how did Muslim civilization, how did Islam fit into all of this? Which is a very good question. Well, as I said in the lecture, Keshav did subscribe to the very common view of the time that this golden Hindu era had been ruined by the era of Muslim rule and the subsequent era of poor rule amongst Hindu priests. And from this decline, the British would come and rescue them. So he did subscribe to that view. Now, in terms of his view of Islam, he certainly thought that Muslims worshipped the same God as he did, and the same God as everybody else did. And he viewed Muhammad as a genuine prophet in the same way in which he viewed Jesus as a genuine prophet, or Troitomo as a genuine prophet. And in his later years, he developed this program of comparative religion, and that did actually result in the first Bengali language translation of the Quran. So, in some respects, he spent a lot of time studying Islam. In other respects, when you look at the way in which he speaks in his public lectures, he divides the world into the East and the West. And the West is Christianity, rationality, materialism. And the East is spirituality and largely Hinduism.
Yes, Nis.
I have a series of questions. Well, the first question is the obvious one. In what sense was he a hero? I mean, you talked about a forgotten hero.
Oh, a forgotten prophet?
A prophet. In what sense was he a prophet? Because at the same time you make the comment that he's representative of his times. And I have questions about that. But in what sense is he a forgotten prophet?
In what sense was he a prophet?
Yeah, he was a prophet.
Yeah, that's a very fair question. So, given the title of the lecture, in what sense was Keshav a prophet?
Because you can also say that he is representative, he's a very representative, and I have queries on that. But you keep saying representative, but in what sense is he a prophet? Where is he even born in a meeting?
Okay, fine. Well, the sense in which he was a prophet really required me to give a slightly different lecture which focused on the later part of his life, because as the 1870s progressed, he always had this idea that there was a new unique form of knowledge in the East, and he began to define this through the 1870s and to call it inspiration. And he came into contact with Ramakrishna. They spent a lot of time in discussion. And Keshav did come to believe by the end of the 1870s that he had access to divine inspiration. And in one sense, he said that everybody has access to divine inspiration, that Indians are particularly good at it, but theoretically everyone does. But in practice, he came to see himself as a prophet and to describe himself, well, he didn't quite describe himself in those terms. He came under great criticism for this, and he delivered a lecture which was entitled, "Am I an Inspired Prophet?" And the answer he gave was no, but the reasons he gave were both ingenious and completely circular, which was to say that he wasn't an inspired prophet because the words that came out of his mouth weren't his words, they were the words of God, which is effectively to say that he is an inspired prophet. But I think there was always a tension within him, especially in his later life. And he came to be seen as a prophet of the new dispensation.
Anybody else now?
I'd like to add to your comments. I mean, you gave a good lecture, but there's much deeper, as you said.
Yeah, of course.
To answer the lady's thing on Islam, he made it very clear that all religions were equal and non-equal within the family of Islam. I'd like to really bring that point out. And in terms of prophecy, there's political prophecy. You're talking about, greater Indian participation within the imperial government. In fact, that was the precursor. That did happen. That's what happened later. That's what gave India independence, frankly. What he started in 1970 was Zulu. And there's so many Indian nationalists who took up the cause and demanded their rights within the imperial government. So in that sense, he's a political prophet as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And he was a very influential figure, and also, just in case you didn't hear, your first point was to emphasise the fact that he did view he gave equal value to the pantheon of all the...
Krishna, who was deeply influenced.
Absolutely right, to all world religions. That is true, but if you look at what he actually says, what he actually reads, there can be no doubt that he's hugely influenced by Christianity and then by ancient Hindu texts. They are the main sources on which he draws. The second thing about him being a political prophet, well, yes, I mean, he was a very influential figure. A number of people who went on to lead various forms of nationalist organisations, to become very prominent in the Indian National Congress, were directly influenced by him. That's definitely the case. I think that with Keshav, right until the end of his life, he had a great faith that the British were doing good in India, and that all that was needed was a spiritual connection. And he actually veered away from politics and from making direct political demands, although one could argue that he was using religion as a way of doing that covertly. But he does explicitly state that he's not interested in politics. He didn't want the British-Indian connection to end. And he had a very idealistic view of historical progress. He had a very idealistic idea that the East and the West would merge together and transform into this new universal humanity. And that idealistic vision of history led him to propose a very idealistic solution to problems of fundamental inequalities of power. So while he would argue that more Indians should be employed in government, that wasn't his major focus. It was this spiritual union that he thought would occur, and it would fall to later people to realise that this wasn't going to happen. Yes, many people would say that he did sow the seeds.
So even at the end of his life, when he was reacting against Britain in terms of its commercialism and materialism and things like that, he didn't come to a stage where he said, well, that's it, we don't want Britain anymore.
No.
He felt Britain was corrupted, it wasn't achieving its potential in the way that India wasn't achieving its potential. So he never saw, I'm just trying to get to, he never saw an India without Britain, he never saw Britain, India itself without Britain.
That's a very good way of putting it. The question was whether he ever saw an India without Britain. And I think the answer to that is no. He didn't see an India without Britain. But he also didn't see a Britain without India.
But that's the idealism.
But that is the idealism, yeah.
Doesn't that make him more of an idealist than a prophet?
Sorry?
Doesn't that make him more of an idealist than any sense of someone who actually had a historical consciousness that would project into the future?
I see. The question is, does that make him more of an idealist than a prophet? Well, when I described him as Bengal's forgotten prophet, I meant it in the sense that he literally, by the end of his life, was a prophet, in the sense that he was a charismatic leader that led a religion which he was the head of, and he led it on the basis that he received or had special access to divine inspiration. That's the sense. I mean, in a literal sense, he was a prophet. And the extent to which he was a prophet of the future or of political reform, I mean, who knows? I don't think so.
You can be a prophet and an idealist at the same time.
Yeah, but there are thinkers who, well, maybe I'm giving a very narrow reaction to what you're saying, but he seems to be someone very, very much of his time. Whereas there are other thinkers from many different times who would seem more relevant to issues that we might deal with now.
Okay, yes. So prophet in the sense of, the comment there was that he was very much a figure of his time, and there have been other figures in history who relate much more to present issues. I think that that's very true.
And he did create a new dispensation, obviously.
And he did create the new dispensation as the prophet of it. But yes, you're right. He's very much a figure of his time, and I make no case for. I don't hold any candle for him or support his views in any way. I think it's very interesting.
Was there any Muslim fundamental reaction at that time?
Sorry?
Muslim fundamental reaction about his prophecy?
Reaction towards
the Muslim community?
Towards him? I think that he was generally seen as a figure who was trying to build bridges between all different religions. And really Keshav's view of religion, although there was these kinds of things about inspiration and various things, really his view of religion was very, very simple. He was saying there is one religion, we all worship the same God. That's fundamentally what he was saying. So people didn't tend to be particularly inflamed by him saying that. They did once he began to claim to be a prophet, of course, then they did.
I think what he's trying to say, that in a Muslim belief the Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet, so because he was proclaiming himself as a prophet, was there a reaction?
Oh, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. I haven't come across it. But that may be because I haven't looked in the right places. Be the honest answer.
That's the Muslim we believe that only the Muhammad is the last prophet.
Of course,
But
yes.
there should be any question. Is there what is about and his prophecy?
I see. Yes. Yes.
So wasn't any.
I see what you mean. Well, I mean, Keshav would have said that
don't think he was proclaiming himself as a prophet of within the Muslim community. It's so different.
No, he was claiming himself to be a prophet in the sense that he had received this idea that all religions were the same, which is a slightly different thing. The other thing about having sort of retreated from the title of this lecture, we've ended up talking about prophets quite a lot, but another thing about Keshav's idea of prophets, they didn't have to be religious leaders. I mean, he saw all kinds of people as prophets. He saw Thomas Carlyle as a prophet. Many scientists he saw as prophets in the literal sense that they spoke the word of God.
Did you want to say something, sir?
I mean, one phrase that you used in your lecture about Keshav thinking of the real India, making the villages and things like that. Did it ever strike him? It is something which is didn't strike a lot of the Bengal Renaissance, which is that the modernity of the capitalism, of the imperialism that was being planted in India, and there were genuine administrators who really believed that, liberal administrators, and wanted to do what they read and what they wanted on a civilizing mission. But that real India, which was based on feudalism, which is a very pre-capitalist notion of how man relate to nature and man relate to man. So did it strike him or the Bengal Renaissance people that here is modernity, the capitalism, we're going to implant that, but then they compromise in a big way with pre-capitalist practices in terms of feudalism. So wasn't he being very idealistic in trying to portray an essential India or an essential Bengal, which from any religion point of view is an illusion, because it hides the real relations.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think anyone who tries to say, you know, what is the essential Bengal, what's the pure Bengal, what's the essential Britain, what's the pure Britain, I mean, there's no such thing. It's, you know, it develops and changes over time, of course, it does. So I think he was being very idealistic. But then again, that idea of there being a pure spiritual India, something pure that was there, that became an important idea for a lot of Indian nationalists, not all, but some. The other part of your question was to do with capitalism.
Yes, let's think about modernity and capitalism. I mean, the intentions, or even if you assume the intentions were honorable and did not depend on total colonialism, that there were individuals who wanted to do that. How did that square with, you know, having peaceful coexistence with the pre-capitalist structure of India?
Yeah, I think.
What is surprising to me is a lot of the colonialism. It's simply bypassed that. So what I'm trying to say is the issue is not necessarily east-west, it's religion and nationalism, but it's essentially a class question.
Yeah. Well, I think
when we use those terms, we sort of bypass the real sort of views of the real by bypassing the class situation. I'm not saying draw a direct line between the class position and what they have to say, but class, at least in that period, mediated a lot.
Yeah.
Because during Keshav's period, 1857 happened. 1871, Hunter's report was there, and the drain theory was being elaborated. So where is Keshav when he wrote them? Which is not to denigrate in any way what he did. Partly he was forgotten because of what the compromises he made on child marriage. That finished him off in substance. But because he emphasized education and had a tremendous influence on the emerging political leaders in Indian Congress, that he was the prophet. But because of his compromises, I mean, the Brahmo Samaj was fractured into various other groups, if I was take over and him. Actually, there were other groups that were emerging because of his views or his practice on that. But there were other things. The other thing that also important is that Bengal Renaissance has various strands. It's not something, I mean, it's just not a direct line from Radha to Keshab Chandra Sen.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Of course.
And the strands are, I mean, it's so I would like to know, how do you place him in those strands? And what is distinctive about it? I can understand the distinctiveness of Brahmo Samaj, which had a tremendous influence in terms of, I mean, the fact that Bengal advanced and was much more capable was because of Brahmo Samaj. I mean, there's I understand that, but in what sense was Keshav Chandra himself distinctive?
Yeah. Okay. So there was quite a few points there. I mean, so one of your points really is how can Keshav be so unaware of the economic reality around him and still promote all these idealistic ideas? Well, I think that that's a perfectly fair observation, and it's difficult to say. I mean, it's very it's not unusual, but people, I mean, the drain theory was starting to gain credence, and Keshav wasn't very in touch with that kind of thing. By that point, he was almost entirely focused on his own spiritual inner life by that point.
He got a clear 1850s.
Yeah. Yeah. That doesn't feature in the way that Keshav views history, which is extraordinary. I mean, it is utterly extraordinary. It's amazing that it doesn't, but it doesn't really. And the second part of what you said was to do with how he was distinctive amongst other figures. That's a very good question. I mean, when I say that he was a representative figure, I mean that he embodied or gave voice to a lot of diverse and divergent strands of thought within this very amorphous thing which some historians have called the Bengal Renaissance. And I think that his highly ambivalent attitude, the way that he could be so, and at times very, very vitriolically critical of Western civilization, and yet simultaneously hold a view that the British had been sent by God, that progress depended on British rule. I mean, how do you hold these kinds of views simultaneously? How do you argue that there should be more Indians employed in the government, but not make any kinds of political demands in general, or see that as key to the future of India? He held together a lot of divergent strands of thought, and those were strands of thought, and of course there were many others, which were pursued by all kinds of different figures. And in terms of his influence, I mean, the fact that he could have such a great influence on someone like Pramabandha Upadhyay and Bipin Chandra Pal, and then of course P.C. Majumdar, his disciple, who moved in an entirely different direction, writing about Jesus. So, I mean, you had people moving very close to Christianity. You had revivalists, other people who were well, actually, these would probably be people who he would be least like, would be the people who were doing economic critiques of imperialism. So Ramesh Chandra Dott and Dadabhai Naoroji, I mean, he's very unlike them. One figure that I think he is quite like, but I'm not sure yet, is Rabindranath Tagore in his post-nationalist phase, and Tagore's sort of Hegelianism, his unfolding of world history, his idealism. I think that there is some sort of connection with Keshav there that does draw a line back in time. I think that there is a connection with post-nationalist Tagore, but I haven't completely figured out what that connection is.
Just going back to, I don't know anything about the history of the Parliament today, stuff post-1971, but going back to what you said about the worldview, that there was a pure the golden age which had been destroyed by corrupt Hindu practices and Islam, and then Britain came to rescue the golden age, or to try and bring back the golden age. Surely he can't have been alone in balancing the fact that Britain was rescuing India and taking it back to this golden age, with thinking that there were bits of the golden age that Britain didn't have. Do you see, he can't be the only person to balance those two views.
No, sure. Sure, no,
So,
he
I don't
wasn't.
know anything about it, but it seems to me that he does seem very much of his time.
In that sense,
Yeah.
in that sense, he certainly is. I think people would say that this whole period of the Bengal Renaissance, if it does have some cohesiveness, then it is characterised to some degree by that problem. How do you reconcile British rule and English education
Was he the only
with
one who did it
Indian
in this
traditions?
way? Sorry, was he the only one who did it in this way, by saying, well, there's parts of Indian culture that are very valid, and there's parts of British culture that are very valid, and we need to integrate them? I mean,
No, I think that was quite characteristic of many people's thought of the time. Certainly characteristic of the Brahmo Samaj as a whole.
The whole Aligarh movement also started around the same time. Within the same community, the whole Aligarh movement started around the same time. So Sam and others, as one level to Parliament same class. That education is the route to social mobility, modernity, whatever they said, and they kept the mouth to mouth and colonialism. Colonialism it was the best that you did talk about, the best of the rule you did talk about.
Yeah.
And didn't the Muslims also dream about a golden age?
Huh?
Didn't the Muslims also talk about golden age? Khilafah Rashidun or something?
Everyone has a golden age, and everyone has someone who they reckon ruined it. I mean, that's...
Every nation has a golden age. Golden age.
Maybe that's one universal principle that we've discovered today.
Any other questions or anything? No? Would you like to ask something? He's from iDistro, he helped set this up for us. If there's no question, I think we will finish here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for giving me your time, and I'm very grateful for all the things that you've raised. It's extremely helpful for me. So thank you very much.